Welcome to the program. I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. DW Gibson here with us. 14 Miles, Building the Border Wall, his new book from Simon Schuster. How's it going, man?
Good. Thanks for having me.
You got it. So this book is fascinating to me on a number of different levels. I mean, just kind of looking into the history of our relationship with the border. Obviously, President Trump's fascination with the border going back to when he was a presidential candidate. And then, of course, the actual people involved with building the wall and the people who are walking by it and all that. So what was it like jumping into this book, and what piqued your interest the most?
Yeah, what piqued my interest was this idea that I noticed about us, that we like to draw lines to define ourselves. I worked on a book about gentrification and how a city changes when a bunch of money comes to town. And when I talked to people about that book, I noticed again and again this idea of the lines we draw defining ourselves coming up again and again, whether it was wrong side of the tracks kind of idea, to I only stay on this block, I only go to this part of town, or even some more more figurative ideas of lines like language and ethnicity that we use to define ourselves. So I decided, what better line to visit to look at this part of our society than the border between Mexico and the U.S. Just because it had been so much a part of our political discussions, cultural discussions, Thanksgiving dinner discussions, and I wanted to go right to the epicenter and see what it was like for the people who actually live there.
That's a really great point about drawing lines, or even just putting people in boxes in general. What was the biggest surprise once you got going with this, and all the different people you talked to? What really blew your mind the most?
Man, I talked to so many people that really made me think about borders in a different way. A couple of good examples. Stan Rodriguez, who's part of the Kumeyaay tribes there, and their land, the traditional land, straddles the border. So about half of it is in the U.S. and half of it is in Mexico. And he really sort of just made me think about borders in an entirely different sense, in that he talked about hundreds of years of history the Kumeyaay have endured after the thousands of years they had already been in place, right? So they had Spanish come and divide up their land. They had Mexico come, divide up their land, and eventually the U.S. came and divided up their land. And they're still there. And Stan said to me, borders, they aren't static. We like to think of them as static, but they are not static. They've been changing over time. And that really stood out to me, just in terms of being able to think about a border in a different way. Another good example is Serge Dedina, the mayor of Imperial City, a small city right up against the border, right there at the Pacific Ocean in Southern California. And he talked about borders being a magnet, this place where people come together to collaborate, to solve problems. He's dealing with so much water pollution from the Tijuana River estuary going out into the Pacific Ocean. He works with Mexican authorities, all kinds of government agencies to solve that problem. But he talks about all the business and all the life that sort of is drawn to the border. And I think that's a wonderfully disruptive way to think about the border. Not this line that divides, but this magnet that attracts people to collaboration.
That's really fascinating, because the people you just mentioned, we don't necessarily think about those people in the everyday conversations about the border. It very much becomes the people in Washington, very much becomes about policy. The great irony is the people that you write about are the ones actually being affected the most by what we're talking about here. So what was it like kind of peeling back the irony where it's these people are living with it every single day, yet it's groups of people who are fighting about it over Thanksgiving dinner, or people in Washington that are fighting about it that will never actually encounter the true impact of the border?
Yeah, I mean, for example, I met a woman named Aurelia who lived, I was studying the prototypes, right? So you might remember 2 years ago, they built in the fall of 2017, 8 prototypes for a border wall in the desert of Otay Mesa. And that's what a lot of the action of the book follows. And Aurelia lives in Las Torres, or she lived in Las Torres, a neighborhood in Tijuana, about 200 feet from the prototypes. Definitely the person living closest to them. She's an American citizen. She was born in Ventura, California. Her father was a Mexican, got deported, and she went back to Mexico when she was a young child with her father, and is having trouble getting back into the U.S. Doesn't have all the documentation. She has her birth certificate, but not her social security card, and is trying to get all that documentation and find a way to get back into the U.S. And so that just shows you right there that complication, that U.S. citizen sort of not only living in the shadow of the prototypes, but not having access to the city where she was born. Just one example, but so many people think about the border in very different ways and interact with it in different ways. I think we obsess about border patrol and the idea of people, patrolling the border, but really so much of the action is at ports of entry. And you talk to people who live at the border, they're sick of 4-hour waits to get in to the country, going either way, whether you're a student who lives in Tijuana, going to school in San Diego. And also all of the crime that's interdicted at the border is often interdicted at the ports of entry. So a lot of people talk about that live near the border want to see more ports of entry, making them more accessible, flow more freely and more securely.
Yeah, there's so many deeper layers to it, and yet some people just boil it down to 14 miles, $147 million, and clearly your book shows more. So what don't we talk enough about when it comes to this conversation about the border?
I think the thing we don't talk enough about is how capitalism sort of factors into this, right? So we had the NAFTA agreement, which has been rewritten now, and it gives us all of these factories in northern Mexico, right on the border, maquiladora as they're called. And a lot of American brands, international brands do manufacturing there, and they get less expensive labor, they get to skip out on duties and taxes, and they get to bring those products into the US to sell to American consumers. And the thing that really stood out to me that we don't talk enough about is how freely cheap products flow across the border, but people who make those products possible can't flow across the border. I think it'd be great if we could talk more about finding a way to honor the people that make those cheap products possible as much as we honor those cheap products. I think that's something we're missing here.